All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this session on NLP for Affective Science. We waited for you, Danielle. But
Did not.
but did
I got interrupted on my way here.
You came in the right moment.
I just said welcome to the session.
Oh, okay. Welcome to the session.
All right. My name is Saif Mohammed. I'm a principal research scientist at the National Research Council Canada, based in Ottawa. I've been working on emotions and affect for 16 years, maybe now. It's been a fun ride, and I see endless possibilities, all kinds of fun things to explore here. So today's tutorial is not going to be like some of the regular tutorials. Perhaps you don't have to talk to strangers, person on your left, person on the right, give some and do some notes and things like that. What's going to happen instead is that I'm going to tell you fun stories, interesting concepts from psychology. Hopefully you'll find it interesting and fun. And all I ask you is to ask me questions. Okay. You can ask me, you can interrupt me as I'm speaking, or I'll stop at various periods and I'll be happy to take questions. So let's get going. So the title, as I put it, is NLP for Affective Science, exploring fundamental questions on emotions through language and computation. I like to use Nemo as my mascot for emotions, because even though all of us are intimately familiar with emotions, we grew up with it, we have it all the time, they're good for us, and sometimes they bother us. So we know them very well. However, if you try to study emotions, if you want to get a handle on emotions, if you want to define emotions, if you want to understand how do these work, what are the underlying mechanisms, how do they impact our brain, our health, our body, our behavior, things get complicated and slippery pretty fast. So that's why Nemo. Okay. So in this talk, we are going to cover concepts of, we're going to use language and computation to get at to have a window into emotions, to see, better understand what's going on there. Because people have been studying emotions for a long time, but there are still so many things we don't know about emotions, right? So it's a great space to work on. And another interesting thing is that if you want to get a window into emotions, you also get a window into the brain and health and behavior and well-being and things like that, because emotions impact all of these. So we'll talk about these things as well. Right. So to begin with, a good question to start is, what are affect and emotions? And maybe many of you know emotions, joy, sadness, fear. What is this affect, right? That sounds a little more I don't know what maybe it's a little more tricky to understand what that is. So let's get into it, and I'll get into it slowly. Affect, you can think of it as the basic sense of feeling something. Okay, so very straightforward, but we'll add to it. Emotions are things like joy, sadness, fear, anger, and things like that. These are called categorical emotions. And to get a little more understanding into this, let's look into these psychological theories, and here we start with some of these stories about how things developed, because once we tell stories, it's easier to understand and remember the concepts, right? So it's always not that way. So we can go thousands of years back if you want to look at when people started studying emotions, but I'll go back only a couple of centuries to Charles Darwin. This is his most famous book, The Origin of Species. It was released in 1860 or so. He was working on this for a few decades before that. But did you know that 10 years after that, he also released another book? It's called The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animal. Okay? Also a very influential book, as it turns out, but less popular perhaps. Anybody know or want to take a guess why Charles Darwin is looking at emotions? Yeah.
Perhaps he seeks to distinguish humans and animals, or sort of add to this thesis of what defines and what differentiates the two.
Right. I was going to put it in simple. I think that's what you mean. But I was going to say, when The Origin of Species was out, it's still a very controversial theory. And a big part of his work is trying to figure out how animals and humans are not that different after all, and that we are animals as well. And there are a lot of commonalities across us, right? And so one of the things that he was finding commonalities with is with emotions. So he would look at things like pursing of the lips to express certain emotions, or raising of the eyebrows to express certain emotions. And he would find out all these things that he would say that, it's not there only in humans, it's also there in animals. So there's something common connecting us all, right? So it makes sense why he was, it's a good, thank you for that answer. And but this is also a place where one of the earliest places where we come up with this idea of universality of emotions, that these emotions are not very specific to humans, or they're not varied across all humans, and that there is something common across all of us, not just across humans, but also with animals. But as time rolled on and we get into 1950s, you had cultural anthropologists like Margaret Mead, and the dominant theory at that time is that emotions are determined by culture and where you are and your past experiences and things like that. And so and that these things can change a whole lot. And so this universality was not the dominant theme at this time. But just like many things, there was a bit of a seesaw going on here. And in 1960, Paul Ekman, a renowned psychologist now, at that time in 1960s, he was a bit of a Sean Connery-esque like character there. He would come out of the woods of Papua New Guinea and he would tell people, hey world, I've gone around everywhere and I've shown people these 6 photographs corresponding to 6 different facial expressions. And wherever I go, everybody is very clear. This is joy, this is sadness, this is fear, this is anger, and so on. For these 6 emotions, not for other emotions, but for these 6 emotions, everybody can clearly identify them, right? And this is true even for people in Papua New Guinea who have a sort of Stone Age culture. They haven't encountered the rest of the world. So this is not a social contagion that we've just learned from everybody to recognize, to use these emotion expressions in this way. So this sort of energized the psychology community in the 1960s and beyond, right? So there was a whole lot of work in this space about what is called basic emotions or categorical emotions. But as would happen in any, you get a bunch of scientists together, soon you had people saying that, you know what, it's not just these 6, there are these 2 as well. So there are 8 basic emotions, says Robert Plutchik. And somebody else says, no, it's not these 8, it is these 10. And some of these are different from the ones that you have. And so actually there are like, half a dozen or so various theories about what are considered basic emotions, right? And if you worked in NLP for in sentiment analysis or emotion analysis, you've seen the Ekman 6 emotions or the Plutchik's 8 emotion wheel and things like that. Because for us, we don't want to deal with 500, 600, 800 different emotions. Well, let's boil it down to something more manageable. So these 6 or 8 emotions was also very attractive for people at NLP. Meanwhile, as this was happening in the 50s, 60s, there was another line of work at this time, and this was led by people like Charles Osgood, extremely renowned, very well-respected psycholinguistics researcher, known to provide some really great ideas and things like semantic differential that revolutionized the field. So he did some work by analyzing how people rate various adjectives, and then did some principal component analysis, dimensionality reduction on those things, and found that there are 3 core dimensions of connotative meaning, or meaning in general, and he would call them valence. Actually, he would call them evaluativeness, potency, and activeness. Okay, but later on in 1980s, you had psychologist James Russell, who also did similar sort of work, but with emotion words, and he came up with the same 3 dimensions. They would call them different names. James Russell would call them valence, arousal, dominance. It's very popular. That name's taken on now. But essentially, they're the same dimensions, right? So when you do principal component analysis or dimensionality reduction, it doesn't come up with a name. It's just a dimension with a bunch of words that might be loaded heavily on that. And then you have a psychologist squinting hard at that dimension and saying, I'll call this valence, So don't get stuck on the names, but these dimensions are important. So what are these dimensions, right? Valence is the dimension of pleasure, displeasure, or happiness, unhappiness, or positive, negative. It's sort of a good way to think about it as well in terms of sentiment. But in psychology, the term used is valence, not sentiment. Another dimension is arousal. This is the active, sluggish, bored, simulated dimension. And you have the dimension of dominance, also called competence, where you have the powerful, weak, or in control of the situation, or not in control of the situation, right? So these 3 dimensions are supposed to be orthogonal. One can be high valence, but low arousal or low dominance. They don't have to go hand in hand with each other. So if you look at words, for example, we see the word like banquet, we can compare them on these dimensions, and we can say banquet indicates more positiveness than funeral. Nervous indicates more arousal than lazy. queen indicates more dominance than delicate, for example, right? So you can compare terms on these dimensions. So you have these two different sort of things going on, the dimensions of valence, arousal, dominance, and you have the categorical basic emotions by Ekman and Plutchik. And these were sort of two different ways in which you could look at emotions for one. But there was still a twist to come, and this happened actually in the 1996, 1997. Lisa Barrett was at that time an undergraduate student at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And she was doing some work with, I believe, depression and anxiety. I could be wrong, she was, and these emotions have that basis in emotions like fear and sadness. And so she would give people various photographs, just like what Ekman had done, and try to replicate these experiments, both with depression and anxiety, and then also, again, directly replicating what Paul Ekman had done. And what she found was that if you take away some of the, constraints of the experimental setup the way it was done earlier, this whole structure falls apart, and you don't get that level of agreement across people when you do that. And now Lisa Barrett is a distinguished professor of psychology. She has about 25 years of research behind her, and she's done a whole lot of work that has, in a sense, discredited a lot of these ideas of Paul Ekman, of things like that there are these basic emotions, right? In fact, she was just last year, she was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award in the Association of Psychological Sciences. She's accomplished an incredible amount of work and added whole new dimensions to our understanding of emotions. So in 2017, she came up with this theory of constructed emotion, building on a body of work that she had done before that, and where she talks about how emotions are not innate, they are not basic, but that we construct these emotions in our brains. And we construct them using various things, including, socialization, the culture, our past experience, but also various signals from inside our body. I'll come to that in the next slide. But there's a lot of stress on variability, that there's a lot of person-to-person variation happening with this. And one of the key things in our theory is that we construct these. One thing that plays a big role in how we construct these emotions is our bodies and how we sense signals from our bodies coming to our brain. Right? This is actually a picture from, for educational purposes for little children, but it's great. It's great at showing the different kinds of feelings we can experience that the brain gets from the body. Okay. So interoception. How many here have heard of this term, interoception? Oh, great. Wow. Oh, beautiful. Fantastic. Wow. Okay. So interoception is the ability to sense signals about your bodily state. Interoceptive signals are sensory representations of the interior of the body, and that they're coming to the brain, right? So let's say you're doing public speaking like me right now. My heart is racing, my palm sweats, and my stomach churns. And that could lead to a construction of emotions in my head of things like anxiety or excitement or both, and things like that, right? And that isn't a one-to-one mapping between the sort of things happening in my body to the emotions. That actually the emotions I'm constructing in my head depend not just on the signals from the body, but also my past experiences and what I've learned about these concepts of emotions and how to behave in various scenarios and things. So, or you can also imagine you're walking alone at night, your heart, you're hearing some footsteps behind you, your muscles tense up, your heart rate spikes, breathing is shallow, and that will lead to construction of emotions like fear, apprehension, hypervigilance, and so on. And similarly, you can also have calming emotions like the one I have. Right? So let's put this all together. Affect, as I said, is the basic sense of feeling. It is sort of a transduced and summarized form of the interoceptive signals. Right? So the body is sending you all kinds of signals to the brain, but from an evolutionary perspective, we need to make decisions quickly and for our well-being, safety, and things like that. And so the signals are transduced and summarized into a form which is called affect, and which is evolutionarily beneficial for us. Right. So it's a feature of consciousness. It occurs in every moment, whether you're thinking about it or not. And usually this affect is talked about along these three dimensions of valence, arousal, and dominance. Right. So if you look at lots of work on psychology, mental health, and things like that, or if you want to do what NLP, what for mental health and things like that, pay close attention to valence, arousal, dominance, these are dimensions that have much more solid standing and grounding in the literature. In contrast, emotions are, as I said before, constructed by the brain using affective and interoceptive signals. The emotion concepts, and it's also based on these emotion concepts that we've learned from culture and socialization. And the way the brain works is with this predictive coding. If you've looked into that, it sort of predicts a model of the world and then gets these signals and then updates the model accordingly, and all that happens, and then you construct these emotions. So essentially, emotions are thought of as a higher cognitive function from which you're constructing these things using the affective signals. And in a way, what the brain is doing is categorizing a continuous signal of affect. The affective signal is continuous, and then the brain is putting categories on it, like joy, sadness, fear, based on all these things that we talked about, right? And this is not very different from how things work for color, right? So color as a physical entity is a continuous signal, but our brain categorizes that into saying this is joy, sadness, yellow, blue, red, things like that, right? So similar emotions. All right, so that was a bit of a long introduction on affect and emotions, but it's fun and interesting, and we'll come back to it throughout this talk. So an important question to do, right, again at the beginning, is why do emotions and affect matter, right? And I've given you plenty of hint already, but just to summarize it a bit here, emotions determine human experience and behavior. They condition our actions. They're there for evolutionary purposes, flight or fight responses, or how to act in different situations. We are able to do that because we have emotions. They're central in organizing meaning. I talked to you about how this work by Charles Osgood and all, where the semantic differential of various words, and you find valence, arousal, and dominance as coming the three primary dimensions having the most information in things. And emotions are a window into understanding our body, brain, well-being. And I talked about evolution before. So there's plenty of reason why emotions and affect matter, right? So affective science is the interdisciplinary field that is focused on understanding emotions and affect, right? And this is interdisciplinary, but it's largely a lot of psychologists working in that space. They have their own conferences, journals, and things like that. So it's a great place to look at things. Now, and they look at things like how do affect and emotions work, emotion regulation, affective neuroscience. They look at how emotions impact our mental health and physical behavior, well-being, so on. And they also look at what agency we have in managing our emotions. Like some of these theories about constructed emotion tell us that, we are not just reacting to this outside world with respect to these emotions, we actually construct them. And so we can have agency in how we manage these emotions and what these things mean. Now, language is very interesting because it's a powerful means of communication, and it's a powerful means of communicating emotions. Emotions themselves are complex, and language itself is a powerful medium to communicate the complexities of emotions, right? And we can do all kinds of things with language, as you well know. I mean, we can be subtle, we can be deceptive, we can be creative, we can be direct. There are all kinds of ways in which we use language to talk about our emotions. And sometimes language can betray our emotions, even if we are not trying to give out what our emotions are. And if language is so important, is relevant to emotions, then you know that NLP is not that far behind, because you can use now NLP to understand these questions of affective science, because NLP is looking at language and computational. So now, on the one hand, it's worth talking. If you're in NLP, then maybe you don't think of this as much, but it's worth noting that language is not an easy thing to work in, just because of the things that I talked about in the previous slide about how creative, subtle, sarcasm, all sorts of things that we do. And so using automatic methods can be tricky. On the other hand, NLP techniques, automatic techniques, can give us, leverage all sorts of interesting things, right? So we can use huge amounts of text and do things. While in psychology, often they are asking people, how did you feel today? How did you feel yesterday? And then, obviously you're limited by the amount of data you get. We can also bring simple to complex NLP techniques. And we also know that language impacts thought and, the linguistic relativity. It should be a Roth hypothesis if you're familiar. So language is not just a means of communicating, language can impact thought, right? And last but not least, using NLP for affective science gives us this sort of complementary view to study affect and emotions compared to the more traditional work in psychology. So if we want to do NLP with affective science, what problems should we work on? So that's an interesting question as well. And sometimes people in NLP have been accused of having a hammer and trying to nail everything they find, or doing all sorts of things that they find interesting without looking at the relevant literature that other people in other fields have looked at. And so I would sort of beat the same drum and say that it's really important to look at what people in affective science have been working on. These are people with experts, they have great theories, and they've been working on it for a long time, and they know all kinds of interesting research questions that really matter. And so we really may get a bunch of questions that we can now think of, like, if we use large amounts of text, can we shed more light into these questions? Right. But NLP for affective science is also useful for not just for affective science, but also from a linguistics perspective. Like, how do we use language to convey emotions? How does language impact emotions? It's also useful in social science. How do emotions impact social cognition, stereotype, morality, and things like that? And we'll get into that a little bit later too. And if you're into AI, and a natural question is, what tools can we build that can help people, clinicians, social scientists, and affective science researchers? All sorts of things. Okay, so this talk, here's a quick outline. So I talked a fair bit in the beginning about the core theories of affect and emotions, what is NLP for affective science, and things like that. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about word-emotion associations. I've been working with word-emotion associations since 2010. And when I first started working on emotions, and I thought looking at words was a very simple, basic unit. It's a nice place to start. And so that's a good place to look at. But I'll talk about some recent work in that space. Then I'll talk about work on emotion arcs. And this is I think, very interesting and relevant, because our emotions often go, they're not like steady, for any sort of dimension you take, our emotions go up and down. Sometimes things are going fairly good, but sometimes, life throws a loop at us. And sometimes we realize that, we get into this sort of pattern of these ups and downs, and things keep repeating again and again. Will studying these things tell us something about, how life works and how emotions impact us and things like that? So I think emotion arcs is a very interesting area to work on. So we'll be looking a bit at tracking emotion arcs and evaluations of it. Then we'll look at how these emotion arcs give us a window into the mind. I'll talk about concepts of emotion dynamics and emotion granularity from psychology. And then I'll talk a little bit about body parts and how the body plays a role in emotions and things like that. And I'll round things off with ethical considerations in emotion recognition, which apply to everything, and we can talk about them. I'll talk a little bit about them throughout as well, but we'll talk more at the end. All right, before we get into the next part, any questions? While I drink some water, if you have questions, let me know. Okay, good. Okay, we'll move on. Word emotion associations. These are essentially lists of words with associated scores for joy, sadness, fear, categorical emotions, or they could be for valence, arousal, dimensions, dominance, things. As I said, I've been working on it for a while, and I've got the chance to build many of these lexicons. In 2010, we released the NRC Word Emotion Association Lexicon. For English, 14,000 words, 8 emotions. This became incredibly popular to our surprise, and a lot of people still using them a whole lot. In 2018, we released a version of it where you had intensity scores for these words, not just 0, 1, but intensity of emotions. 2018, I also worked on the valence, arousal, dominance lexicon, which, as I said, is especially relevant if you're working on mental health kind of space. I think that categorical emotions like joy, sadness, fear are very interesting if you're working on things like digital humanities, or in social sciences, where you're looking at how do people refer to emotions and things like that. They don't say valence, arousal, dominance. They say things like joy, sadness, fear. So studying that is interesting there. We also have a word color association, if anybody's interested. But today, let me talk to you a little bit about anxiety. not one of the basic emotions usually, but certainly an extremely important emotion. Anxiety is defined as the anticipatory unease about a potential future negative outcome. Right? And the first thing I want to say that this is a very common emotion. We all have it, and it is a very beneficial emotion, right? So imagine if you're in the woods and if you're not worried about the bear coming and attacking you, you might not take certain precautions and things like that. It also helped us, way back in early human stage. Anxiety helps us. We build shelters for protection, things like that. But anxiety can also manifest itself into mental disorders, right? So, and one of the theories that's talked about a bunch in this space is that the environment around us has changed so much in the last 20 to 30 years that what our sense of anxiety was developed to do over millennia is not able to keep up with the change in our environments. And so you have all the social media and dopamine hacking and things like that. And so we get a whole lot of anxiety triggers again and again and again. And when you have too much of that and it interferes with your functioning of your daily activities, then you start having anxiety disorders. Right. So some people say there is a epidemic of anxiety disorders right now. So another reason why looking at anxiety is, I think, very relevant and interesting and important. Because we have the NLP perspective, I always like to think about why creating language resources for this is important. And for anxiety, there are a lot of reasons, from understanding anxiety and the underlying mechanisms, how anxiety changes with age, when are we anxious, what are we anxious about. If you want to study all these things, you want to have good language resources. Or maybe you want to study how language shapes anxiety or how culture shapes anxiety. So from a linguistics perspective, those are interesting things to look at. Maybe you want to track anxiety towards various targets of interest, like climate change or immigration or biological vectors and things like that. Again, having good resources will help you. Or maybe you want to just build good automatic systems to detect anxiety. You might also be interested to study how anxiety impacts behavior in physical and virtual environments. Or maybe you're interested in digital humanities and you care about what makes good characters and good story arcs and what's the role of anxiety in that. Right? So all kinds of ways why this is important. So last year, I published this work where we created 44,000 a repository of anxiety associations for 44,000 English words and also 10,000 multi-word expressions. The scores go from -3 to 3. There's also a categorical version of it. We talk about how we do a whole lot of quality control measures like interspersing gold questions in the crowdsourcing effort. And we show that the split half reliability is around 0.82, which is pretty good. This is essentially the test, retest, or annotation, reannotation reliability. Right? And if you redo the annotations, are you getting very similar scores and similar rankings of words based on anxiety, or is it wildly different? Right? So you want it to be reliable, as in similar scores. Closer to 1 means higher reliability, and so we show that people are good at telling anxiety for words. So what can you do with lexicons? Turns out there's a whole lot of things you can do. In this paper, one of the experiments that we did was looking at the rate at which children acquire anxiety words with age, right? So this is an interesting question again, right? So children acquire vocabulary from age 2 to age maybe earlier to all the time as they're growing up. At what point do we, or at what rate do we learn high anxiety words? At what rate do we learn calmness words? And does that change with age? Is it a flat trajectory or things go up and down, right? So that was the question we wanted to answer. And here you have the graph for that. In green are the scores for anxiety, for calmness terms, and in orange red are the scores for anxiety terms. The x-axis is the age of the child from 2 to 17, and the y-axis is the percentage of the words that they're learning, acquiring, pertaining to that particular category. So what do we see here? Between ages 2 to 5, we are learning a whole lot of calmness words as kids, right? So that's great. You have infants, you're giving them lots of love. They are learning lots of calmness words. That's the vocabulary that they're building. But after 5, the vocabulary of calmness words is essentially falling off. You're learning fewer and fewer new calmness words, while the vocabulary of anxiety words is increasing and ever increasing, actually, keeps rising forever. I guess the reality of the world. Here's another experiment that we did. Let's say you take the WorryWords lexicon and you want to track, anxiety in social media, let's say for climate change or something, right? How good can you do with that? So we did an experiment with that, and here we say we're showing the results. In yellow is the gold arc. That is the way anxiety is changing in the social media over time, and in green is the results simply by using the lexicon, just counting things up and getting that. And as you can see, the arc is really good. Correlations about 0.9. We also do various parameters, like, one of the things in creating this arcs is that you have to aggregate data. Like, let's say for every day there are 1,000 tweets, you take the average anxiety score for that. That gets one y-axis point. Then for the next day, you get another y-axis point, and so on. You create the arc. And it might not be a day, it could be months. Maybe your granularity data about is years. But the more data you aggregate per bin, the more accurate your results are. And these are results with just a few hundred tweets, I think, per bit. So you don't need too much to do really well. Yes.
Just about the previous example of the kids.
Yeah.
How did you measure that? Like,
Yeah, good question. So there are data sets out there by Bryce Bart et al. From University of Ghent. He's in the psychology department there. And they have these data sets of at what age various children acquire various words. Right? So when you're young, you acquire simple words of certain kinds. As you're growing up, you're learning new and more new words. So they have some sort of norms of what tends to be the case. And so we can combine that lexicon with the WorryWords lexicon to see what percentage of these words at age 3, let's say, are calmness words, what percentage are anxiety words.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Was there any distinction between gender of what words the kids were learning?
That's a great question. That resource, I don't think has gender information, but perhaps sure, there must be some resource there looking at gender differences in acquiring of words. And
since there's a difference later, right, with alexithymia, like emotion associations.
Right. Yes. I think it's a very interesting space to look at.
Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up question to that, in that this trend to what degree is affected by, as you said, the complexity of word itself? Because I can imagine, like, say, anxiety words, I don't know, like melancholia maybe is not a simple word for a 2-year-old to learn, whereas probably happy would be like much easier.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of words. It's a tricky one. I should go and look up the lexicon for words that 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds use. But there are words that even young children use pertaining to anxiety, right? But I think you're raising an interesting point. Perhaps some sort of even if that's the case, though, it's sort of interesting. Why is it that anxiety words are longer and calmness words are shorter, right? And we know there are other sort of correlations that shorter words tend to be more frequent than longer words and things like that, right? So it's still a function thing that you're looking at. But if you're interested, you can actually download these lexicons and look at the kinds of anxiety words that young children are learning at later. And one can do this length comparison as well for both. That's a good point. Any other questions? All right, move on. One more lexicon, and then we'll get to the emotional arcs. This is very new work. I'm going to publish that talk about that next week at ACL. So this work I call Words of Warmth, Trust and Sociability Norms for 26K English Words. And even though that title is focused on warmth, this concept is very much tied to competence. Who here has heard warmth and competence together as a concept? Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know of this literature for a while as well, but turns out there is 3 decades of social cognition and stereotype research work, things that people in NLP care about as well, right? So there is 3 decades of research in social cognition, especially by a very accomplished researcher, Susan Fisk, where they talk about how when when human beings, when we think about another person, or when we see another person, or we think about another group of people, we automatically, very quickly make assessments about this other person or other group. And we do so along two primary dimensions. And these two primary dimensions that they've identified are warmth and competence. And once again, don't get stuck up too much on the name. The name is just trying to capture this sort of dimension. And they've done this sort of dimension reduction experiments, and it's held out for a whole lot of time. And they talk about the dimensions that we assess people are on warmth and competence. Now, competence is essentially, as I said earlier as well, dominance. It's the same sort of word, competent, incompetent, powerful, weak, intelligent, not intelligent, that sort of thing. So I already have a lexicon for that with the valence, arousal, dominance lexicon. So there are resources for that. But warmth, I thought, was quite interesting. Warmth seems like a subset of valence. Valence is a very broad concept of positive and negative, or a pleasure, displeasure. Warmth seems like a subset of it. And if you look into some of the psychology literature, social cognition literature, sorry, they talk, many of the researchers there are also talking about how warmth really should be split into two categories of sociability and trust. Sociability is the friendliness, gregariousness, that sort of dimension. And trust is the morality, goodness, sincerity, integrity dimension, right? And so when I decided to work on this space, and I wanted to create a lexicon for warmth, because this thing about judging people and judging groups of people and stereotypes, if these dimensions are playing a big role, I thought creating a lexicon for warmth would be very important. But since people are also, a bunch of people are saying you shouldn't just do warmth, you should do these two dimensions, what I did was create lexicons for sociability and trust, both separately, and then I sort of combined them, take the union to create that warmth lexicon. But let's look a little bit more about this literature, about what people are talking about with these stereotypes. This slide here is showing work by Cuddy, Fisk, and Glick from 2008. It's showing American stereotypes. And note, these are stereotypes. These are not innate qualities about people, right? These are there to study stereotypes. So if you look at so you have competence on the x-axis, warmth on the y-axis. And if you look at the top right quadrant, you will see, Americans think other Americans are very warm and very competent. Okay, so that's not surprising. That's true for all what is called in-groups. So other people like you think of them as more competent, more warm. If there are people, for whatever reason, you think they are not like you, they're in your out-group, whether they belong to a different country, a different religion, maybe they're wearing a different color of shirt that day. People make these in-group, out-group connections for all sorts of reasons, and they do it very subconsciously. And if you are in the out-group, you are often there's a tendency to judge the outgroup person as less warm or less competent. So if you look at the bottom right, you see words like homeless are, considered low warmth and low competence, according to Americans. That's stereotype. People from certain other countries are in that group. Feminist is considered in that group. This is work in 2008, where they were asking people, to give descriptions about things, and they got these ratings from that, right? If you look at elderly, you will see them in the top left, so higher warmth, but not much competence. Same for disabled and things like that. On the other hand, if you look at the groups for like the rich, Asians, or Jews, they are considered high competent, but low warm, right? So again, these are American stereotypes. In different countries, there might be different stereotypes. These stereotypes also have an impact with emotions, our main topic, of course. If people are on the top right quadrant, they often evoke a sense of admiration. So people in your own in-group, when they do something, you are happy for them. If somebody in the bottom right, high competence, but they're not in your group, they accomplish something, that's a sense of envy. For people on the bottom left, that's generally a sense of contempt. And people on the top left, that's pity. So it's connection between emotions and stereotypes. Why create these language resources for warmth, competence, sociability, and trust? Again, just like many of the other things that I've said, these have applications in a whole bunch of different fields, from psychology, computational social science, human-computer interaction, even like artificial agents that you want to build. They need to be able to assess warmth and competence aspects of people. Digital humanities, again, characters and rounded characters versus flat characters. Is warmth and competence playing a role over there, right? So in commerce, you care about how do people think about my product? Do they think of it warmly? Do they think it's very effective or competent, or do they think it is incompetent and they think it's poor, right? So these things matter a whole bunch. So this is why, as I said, I created this lexicon for warmth, and we also include because warmth analysis often goes hand in hand with competence, we also include the dominance lexicon from the VAD lexicon in here. So if you just download that, you'll get one. This graph here just shows the distribution of words as per these different categories of warmth and sociability and trust. And the main thing I just want to show you is that it's not that most of the words are associated with neutral category. You've got a whole bunch of words associated with various levels of these dimensions. So what can you do with this? And again, from an affective science perspective, I think looking at how children acquire languages is very fascinating. And so we did sort of a similar sort of experiment to see at what age people learn these warmth and competence words. Are we learning warmth words first, or are we learning competence words a whole lot first? Are we learning high warmth or low warmth first? And is it roughly the same over as time goes on, or is this changing with time, right? So as you may have guessed, things change a whole lot, and you can see some of the graphs here. Turns out in the beginning of our lives, we learn a whole lot of high warmth words. That seems great, right? So mothers, interaction, parents with children, that makes sense. You have a lot of high warmth words, and then the low warmth words we are learning as more and more as age goes on. The sociability graph is very similar to the warmth. The trust one is interesting. We learn high trust words in the beginning again. That seems interesting and good, but it doesn't fall off like the warmth thing. Is there fairly steady for a while and then peters off a bit towards the end. Low trust, we go from a little bit in the beginning to lots of low trust words as we age. Competence is, I think, kind of interesting. It actually gives you the opposite sort of trend, as in right in the beginning, we are learning lots of low competence words. Somewhere as 9 and 11, we are learning lots of high competence words. And then again, that drops off a bit. Both of them drop off a bit. I don't know what this actually means. I should talk to some child psychologists about this and get a better sense of it. But perhaps it's because, in the beginning, children are not very capable. And so there is a lot of low competence vocabulary that they get at. Yes.
Is this just an error, or does it the low competence collapse at 17?
I should check that as to why there is no data from after 16 and to 7. Just for 17, the data is missing, I guess. I'll double check.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So it's not a collapse or something. It's just the data missing.
Yeah, it's just that it looks like the data is missing, unless there was very few words there for low competence. Perhaps it's more this thing, but it seems surprising. I'll look at that.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Any other questions, sir? Okay, another experiment that we did was looking at stereotypes. And before I get into that, a quick warning again, these are stereotypes. Oh, that's right. Here it is. That these are stereotypes, not inherent properties. So these are there to study stereotypes, these experiments. It's also important to consider things like coverage, domain, ambiguity, social cultural effects when you use, tools like lexicons to do analysis. Especially you don't want to do analysis of single snippets and try and get some sort of considerations. You want to analyze huge amounts of data and find some broader, substantial changes in things to get at these trends. We'll talk more about the ethics things towards the end as well. Actually, come back to this slide. When looking at these stereotypes, there are two ways in which we can look at it. So let's say we want to look at stereotypes towards immigrants. I can directly look up my lexicon to look at, what do people say the warmth and competence associated with immigrants, and how does that compare to other concepts, right? So that's a direct lookup. But far more interesting is to look at co-occurring terms of this target of interest, right? So if I actually look at how people are talking about immigrants on social media, Reddit, or things like that, and I see what are the words around target, what words are being used over there, and are they high competence words, or are they low competence, high or high warmth, and is that changing with time? that can give a very interesting window into these sort of stereotypes. So for this experiments, we used geolocated tweets from US and Canada from 2015 to 2021. It's called the TUS dataset. It has 3.1 million posts. And so geolocation is important. We'll see why shortly as well. And if you just take the average warmth of all the words in these 3.1 million tweets, that average warmth is 0.5 in a scale from -1 to 1. So what's that telling us? It's telling us that on average, we are using a lot of warmth words in our language, right? And that's not surprising. There's a lot of other sort of related research that also points to this sort of positivity bias in language. We use lots of positive words. The competence thing is, I think, also kind of interesting to look at because it's also positive, but it's markedly smaller. So we are not going around using high competence words in everyday language to the same extent as warmth words. Right. Again, I think that has interesting sort of connections with evolutionary biology and things like that. How to mention social harmony in groups and things like that. Using warmth words is important. That's what that's showing. Right? All right, here's one of the examples where we analyzed various gender-related terms like father, mother, husband, grandmother, sister, and so on. On the left is the direct method, just looking up the words in the lexicon that we have. And what do we note here is that the y-axis is warmth, and we see that in terms of warmth, people say all of these concepts are very warm, right? They're all very warm, especially compared to various other things. So we're not distinguishing that. But in terms of competence, we see quite a bit of variation. And that, to some extent, that's not surprising, right? So when we think about grandparents, we are thinking of them as lower competence, perhaps, in certain contexts. Although in various other contexts, they are extremely competent. But the stereotype is that they are lower competence. And children, again, are lower than, like, say, adults and things like that. But noticeable is the gender stereotypes, right? So you see the sort of male counterparts being thought of as more competent, and that shows up in many places. But it actually shows up even more in this other graph on the right, where we are looking at co-occurring words of these same words. And we don't use the target terms as lexicon entries, so those are removed from the lexicon. So we are only looking at the co-occurring words, which do not include any of these target terms. And then we count out, what's the average warmth of this data and what's the average competence, and you see the graph on the right. And you see the first thing that you see is that even though we think of all these relations as roughly equally warm, in terms of the language that we use, we do see a spread over there as well. And competence, again, we see a spread, and again, we see these gender stereotypes. Here's another graph, and this one is showing various social groups, and you again see various sort of American stereotypes, because this is an American data set as well. Like a Muslim, Jew, and immigrant are given get low warmth scores, both just direct and also, but more so in the co-occurring words that we use around them when we talk about them in social media. Words like elderly, underweight, obese, these tend to be on the bottom left side. This also matches up with psychology literature as to when you ask people directly, those sort of things. I think God is sort of interesting over here. I thought that was fun to do. If you just ask people, then God is like high competence, high warmth, is there on the top right over there. But if you look at the language people are using around God in social media, it falls off a bit from that thing. Another point to look at is LGBTQ over there. It's interesting that it is very high warmth and competence, even despite knowing that we know there are stereotypes, negative stereotypes against this group. So why is that happening? Right? If I just sort of make this point, I think it's important when you are looking at this data to be careful about what this data is telling you, because the people who have various negative stereotypes and are talking negatively about these groups in social media may at times be using different names for that same group. So while a lot of people might use terms like Muslim and Jew, but perhaps for LGBTQ people, you have many more demeaning words that these people are using. And so what this might be telling us is that people who tend to use the term LGBTQ tend to use lots of warmth and competence words around this term.
I was just wondering, is there a reason, or do you have thoughts why the variance in the direct terms is so much higher than in the co-terms, like the axis?
Yeah. Let me think about that a bit. it's a little tricky to compare variances, I think, because these are different scales. You can always rescale things, and the methodology is different from them.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure that is directly comparison.
it might just be an effect of the.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it might have to do with the fact that you always have multiple code terms, right? So I think that kind of makes it
I like
closer
that
to
answer.
the
Yes.
middle.
I like that answer. Yes.
Yeah.
But that brings to an interesting point that I think of all the time, especially when I'm talking about students, is that when you look at a metric and you have these scores and you have these differences, it's very easy for human beings, reviewers, to look at the score differences and say, oh, this score difference is really small, and this score difference is really big. But really, it just depends on the metric. You can rescale things, you can use whatever kind of metrics, and you should never rely simply on a score difference. You have to do other things like looking at over different periods of time, are we systematically and again seeing this difference in score? And you can also do statistical significance and things like that, of course. Yeah.
I have a very different question. How many data points did you use for this analysis? And do you have an estimate of how many you should use for making conclusions like these?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have the numbers right now, but I think we used some sort of threshold for, the overall data set is 3.1 million tweets, but not all of these words occur, very frequently, but these are fairly common words in that. I'm sure we had some sort of minimum threshold of 100 or 500 instances.
So you didn't do any pre-filtering, but you got 3 million tweets and then.
Yeah, that's right. That's geofiltering.
Just a quick question as well on the data set. I'm just wondering, do we do some kind of basic like filtering on the in general, why do we choose like tweets? I know that it's easy to get, but
Not anymore.
The language that people use on Twitter in general, I don't know. I feel like it's very biased.
That's a fair point. I've been working with Twitter for a fair amount of time, and I have deep respect for Twitter as a language source. And that is because of the volume of data that you get. While it's very easy to look at certain aspects of Twitter data and say that, oh, well, it's sort of weird in this way and things like that. It's a major platform where we talk about all sorts of things in the world, right? Show me another platform where you can get, realistic, ecologically valid real data about people in this kind of volume. And, there are all kinds of limitations that we have from other places. I'm not saying Twitter is perfect in every way, but there are a lot of really good qualities about it. Another good point is that often Twitter is, especially for NLP people, you've got language, you also have images there if you're interested in that. Often people write in sort of they're putting out this thought, it needs to be somewhat self-contained for other people to understand it. And yes, there are all kinds of weird sentences there, but you're drawing inferences from millions of tweets and things like that. So often that works.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on. Here's the final one about this warmth and competence thing. This is kind of interesting as well. It's a little complicated in the graph, but I'll just tell you what's going on here. The red dashed lines are the average warmth and competence for all the tweets, if you put them all in one big bag, from Canadians. Okay. And if you take all the tweets from Americans and put them in a big bag and count up the warmth and competence scores for them, you get the blue lines, which is actually on the left and at the bottom. The screen's not very clear here. What we notice is that the difference is substantial. It's marked. Canadians tend to use markedly more positive, markedly more warmth words and markedly more high competence words, or fewer low competence words. That's one thing that jumps out of that. But the main intention of this graph is to look at how do Canadians view themselves, how do Canadians view Americans, and how do Americans view Canadians, and how do Americans view themselves. Because this is geolocated data from US and Canada, we know we have that information, so we can do this sort of analysis, right? And what do we find is that Canadians view themselves as more warm and more competent, or at least they're using more high warmth and high competence words when they're using tweets that mention Canada or Canadians, right? Well, so they view themselves as more warm. They also view themselves as more competent than when they mention Americans or America. So that's a standard in-group bias, right? That fits with that notion. Americans also view themselves as more competent than Canadians. Okay, again, standard in-group bias. But Americans But despite the Canadians being an outgroup, Americans view Canadians as being more warm. When Americans talk about Canadians, they are using more high warmth words than when they are talking about Americans, right? So the Canadians are nicer stereotype seems to be stronger and outweighing this outgroup bias kind of thing, which I think is kind of fun. All right, so that was a bunch about lexicons. We'll go to emotion arcs. I want to make it clear that you don't have to work with emotion lexicons to work on emotion arcs and things like that. There are all kinds of interesting things that you can do with lexicons, like you look at child acquisition language. They also are very interpretable and things like that. But you can use your favorite algorithms and do interesting things. All right. Emotion arcs are very relevant in commerce, psychology, and so in commerce because people care about ups and downs of emotions for their product. In psychology because people care about the individual's emotions over a period of time. What are the ups and downs there? And in stories, people care about things like character arcs and story arcs, right? So if you haven't seen Kurt Vonnegut's video on YouTube about story arcs, you should go and check it out later today. Super fun and interesting. He came up with this idea first in 1981 or so, but the video is from 1997 or something like that. So he talks about how stories have these prototypical arcs, man in the hole, Cinderella story arc, and things like that. It's really interesting. In 2010 and 11, when I first created the NRC Emotion Lexicon, I thought it'll be fun to showcase the power of the lexicon by creating these emotion arcs in fairy tales and stories. And I published this at a workshop because there was no evaluation for how good an emotion arc is, right? It's very hard to ask people to read a whole book, or even for a book that like Harry Potter, to ask, okay, show me the emotion arc for the story or for Hermione or and things like that. It's a hard thing to do. So I published that at a workshop, but it's got, I think, over 500 citations right now, and there's a whole bunch of work in digital humanities with these emotion arcs, which is kind of cool. So as I was saying earlier, you can create these emotion arcs using different methods, latest machine learning methods, or you can use lexicon methods. They all have their pros and cons. While machine learning methods are very good at finding, long distance dependencies and figuring out for a given sentence what is the emotion or things like that. When you're talking about aggregate level analysis, like doing this for whole sentences, we don't yet know how good the accuracy of the different methods are. And that has been very little work. When people come to us at NRC for sentiment analysis, we always tell them use simple methods like these lexicons and you'll do really well. But for a long time, there wasn't a very good evaluation of these things. But I'm really happy that 2 years back, Daniela Teodorescu did this really good work where we decided to evaluate how good these different approaches are. And she used a large number of emotion categories and dimensions, 36 data sets in all, various sort of platform data and data from multiple languages to do these evaluations. And and there's a very sort of simple trick that we use. I'll be happy to get into that later if you want. And I showed you the arc for anxiety earlier. Here's then one for valence. Valence works really well. Valence is a very strong signal. As I told you before, it's a primary dimension of things. So the signal from these lexicons that you get is very strong. And the correlation in this case was, I think, 0.96 or something like that. So in general, the lexicon-based methods do really well as long as you're aggregating at least a few hundred instances for each bin, like Sunday, Monday, or this month, next month. Okay, so I wanted to just set that stage a bit because just to make clear that we are now very good at evaluating these things and that our automatic methods are very good. But what can you do with this, and why do we care about these sort of things, right? One interesting concept here is called emotion dynamics, and this is also from psychology and connects to the brain. Things like that. Who here has heard of emotion dynamics? Okay, not very common. So I didn't know this until a few years back as well. I have to give credit to Will Hipson, who was at the University of Carleton in the psychology department. He told me about these things and got me interested in this space. And I looked at the literature in psychology. So what they're talking about here is that different people have different sort of characteristics about how their emotions are and how they change over a period of time. Okay, for example, this young person over here in the green shirt might be a cheerful person in general, right? So that home state might be fairly high, while maybe my home state is a little lower than that, right? Now, if something happens, we move out of our home state, and go into another state, or like, higher valence or lower arousal or higher dominance, but we don't stay there. That is not how our bodies are designed to do. This idea of homeostasis, and we come back to our home state of where we tend to be. Okay. Now, if something negative happened, my friend over here might be bouncing back really quickly, right? While me, for example, I'll be like, well, this person said something to me yesterday, and I'm still thinking about it. And it takes me a long time to come back from a negative sort of state. So these are characteristics about how our emotions tend to change over a period of time. And in psychology, they would do a lot of self-reports, asking people, how do you feel today? How do you feel when this happened? What happened 7 days back, and so on. And then they try to create these emotion arcs and also characterize these emotion arcs mathematically, right? But as you can imagine, first of all, the amount of data you can get is limited. And secondly, there are well-known biases. People are horrible at recollecting how they felt at various times in their past. So other methods are generally very useful for this as well. So, and as we know, another window into emotions is through our words. So the natural idea for us was that, if we look at people's language on, let's say, Twitter or social media, can we create these emotion arcs from them and then characterize features about where our home base tends to be? What is our recovery rate, rise rate, and things like that? So establish some baselines, and that might help us in better understanding emotion dynamics. So this was the first work in 2021 with Will Hibson, and we first did this on fictional characters because you do things on fictional characters, they don't get mad at you. And so we analyze all kinds of fictional characters, and you rank them by various aspects about their arcs and things like that. Feel free to check it out if you find interested in that work. We then did some work on tweet emotion dynamics, where we looked at data from US and Canada, the geolocated tweets that I was telling you about earlier as well, and to look at an aggregate level, are there differences between American tweets and Canadian tweets, systematic differences, what was the impact of COVID and things like that. And then finally, we did some work with emotion dynamics on looking at it as, whether they are indicators of health at an aggregate level, along with these colleagues over here. One important point to note is that just by characterizing these emotion dynamics of a particular person, you cannot diagnose these people clinically in any way. That's a lot of overlap between these various people. There's a lot of person towards person variation. But what we find here is that at an aggregate level, different cohorts of groups tend to have certain systematic differences. I don't want to get in too much into the dynamics. I want to talk about emotion granularity. It's sort of a sister concept, but unlike single emotion arcs, we are now going to talk about pairs of emotion arcs from the same person. But first, let me tell you what is emotion granularity. And for this, we come back to the protagonist of our story, Lisa Barrett. In 2001, way back in 2001, she created this concept of emotion granularity. She did this very influential work. It's also called emotional differentiation. And she says how different people can have different capabilities in terms of identifying and describing their feelings, right? So, for example, my friend over here, sorry to pick you all the time, my friend over here might be very good at telling when they are happy versus when they are elated, when they are angry versus when they are annoyed, or angry versus sad, and things like that. So you might use these terms very systematically. In certain contexts, you use this term. In certain other contexts, you use the other term. You don't mix them up. Well, on the other hand, perhaps let's say I have a general sense of, things are not very good. And then I say things like angry or sad or annoyed fairly interchangeably when that happens. I'm not very systematic, or I'm not very, differentiating these emotions as well. So in this case, you are said to have higher emotion granularity. I am said to have lower emotion granularity. Yeah.
So just a quick question. Would you relate this to the Sapir-Whorf theory? So essentially, you're limited by the language and your ability to even recognize emotion.
So that's an extreme version of it. But I'm glad you asked this question. So what people, Lisa Barrett and other people are talking about here is that all of us have some sort of ability to do this thing of using these words consistently. It's a spectrum. It's not a 0-1 thing. And sure, there might be people way back on the zero end, but in general, we have varying abilities of this. And the point that they are trying to make is that this ability of emotion granularity, and this is work not just done by Lisa Barrett, but since 2010, there has been an ocean of work in this space where they talk about higher emotion granularity, where you are using these terms systematically, tends to lead to better mental health outcomes, better physical health outcomes, better behavioral outcomes. While in contrast, things like maladaptive behaviors or overeating, aggression, anxiety, depression tend to correlate more with lower emotion granularity. So there is something in how we are constructing, recognizing and constructing these emotions and talking about these emotions that seems to be connected to various health aspects of this, right? Again, in psychology, the only way they can do this is that they would ask people, right? How are you feeling today? What happened today? How are you feeling today? And you keep asking that over time. And if you see that this person in similar contexts is using very consistent words, or they're using these emotional, co-endorsing multiple emotions at the same time, that kind of gives you a sense of the emotion granularity. So with this wonderful team out here, this work was led by Krishna Priya from University of Toronto. She's now at NRC. She was the leader, but notably we had Kirsten Lindquist and Mallory Feldman, who are psychologists in Affective Science from University of North Carolina, Affective Science Lab. In fact, it was Mallory who told me about emotional granularity a few years before this. And so together we did this work to see to what extent are we co-endorsing multiple emotions in text, and can we sort of create a metric for emotion granularity just by looking at textual data, right? And to do this, what we do is look at these emotion arcs, and for a given person, we look at their multiple emotion arcs, and we see, for example, anger versus sadness. Are these arcs correlated, or they are not correlated? To what extent are they correlated? Because that is telling us the extent to which we are co-endorsing these emotions, either directly by saying I'm happy or sad or angry, or through other words that connotate these emotions, right? So the more these arcs are correlated, the more you're using them interchangeably, and you lower the emotion granularity. Right? So we created a metric like that, and we did some experiments where we found that if you have different cohorts of people who say they have been diagnosed on social media, they say that I've been diagnosed with PTSD, ADHD, and so on. This is a data set created by a group. I think the work was published in the social media journal a few years back. And so we used that data set and we created this emotion granularity from that. And we found that indeed, for the cohort that has PTSD, ADHD, and so on, there is lower emotion granularity, statistically significant than the control group. And again, I must say, it's not that, there's a clear separation of PTSD and the control group. There's a whole lot of overlap. So it's not at an individual level. You cannot diagnose this, but as a group, these cohorts are statistically significant. And the patterns for various emotion granularities, for positive emotions, for negative emotions, various different experiments all fall consistently with what one would expect from the psychology theory. Yes.
I'm not a psychologist, but I'm just wondering, people that state on social media that they have some illness, isn't it a certain group of persons too? Because I guess many people wouldn't.
There are various biases in that sense. Absolutely right. The people who created the data set in the beginning did some really good work in terms of identifying self-disclosure, first of all, because you want to be clear. Are you just saying I'm depressed today? We're not counting that. We want to know these people were getting data set where they were using clinical diagnosis terms in that. And they also had a clinician a clinician who was going through a bunch of these methods that they had and looking at the data sets to make sure that the final data was more reasonable. But your point about there are certain types of people who might want to self-diagnose, that's absolutely true, right? And you don't want to draw too many conclusions from just one data set. Ideally, you want this sort of work from all kinds of different data sets, all kinds of different approaches, and only then, when all of the arrows are pointing in the same direction, can you draw these really big conclusions. But you need to start somewhere and do some. Right? All right, how am I doing for time? Okay, not bad. Let's talk about the body now. This is work in submission right now, but it's really fun, and it's somewhat weird, one might think. I mean, way back in 2010 itself, my colleague Peter Turney, with whom I created the NRC emotion lexicon, he told me about how in various Eastern philosophies and things like that, there are these clear sort of associations and connections between parts of the body, especially organs and emotions. He also told me about George Lakoff's embodiment theory, about how there's a lot of in how we talk about terms is tied to embodiment and concrete domains and things like that. So that seemed interesting to explore the connection between the body and the body and emotions, or body and mind, but I wasn't really sure. But over time, I started to see more and more work in this space, and finally took the plunge and we did this work. I'm super excited about this thing. And we're seeing a lot of work, especially in the last 10, 12 years, on the impact of the body, of the body, not just on the health of the body perspective, but impact of the body on the brain. Connections between the body and the brain, and how they're not all that distinct from each other. They're very tied to each other. There are also work showing, the body impacts how we conceptualize and perceive things. And clearly, as we saw with the constructed emotion theory, interoception, the body is playing a role in how we construct these emotions. There's also work coming from various disciplines, from medicine to psychology to affective science, cognitive science, philosophy, all of these places where they're talking about this connection between body and mind, right? And what are they talking about, right? So there are a lot of theories coming out from all of these places. The embodiment theory I talked about, let me read out what it says. Our physical body and its interactions with the world are fundamental to our cognitive processes, emotions, and experience, right? So this is very famous body of work which talks about, our mind is not just in isolation reacting to what's happening outside. Our body is playing a crucial and a super important role in these cognitive processes. There's also the theory of conceptual metaphor, which is talking about how to understand abstract concepts, we use concrete domains and metaphors from there, right? So, for example, grasp is a physical act. I'm grasping for my glass. But we also use grasp for the abstract concept of understanding some concept. And the reason we tend to do these things is because we want to take something concrete and transfer its knowledge to this abstract domain, so that's easier to understand for people, right? So it's a crucial part about how language works. And one of the things to note here is that when we bring things from the source domain, the body, movement, and space is a very important source domain from which we bring things into the abstract domain and do this sort of embodiment aspects. So body part mentions offer a rich entry point into conceptual metaphor. Studying them can help reveal how language encodes embodiment and thought. So looking at body parts seemed like very interesting from that perspective. There are also theories of mindfulness, being aware of the present and our body, leading to better outcomes. There's work on constructed emotion, we talked about that. And there are various theories of interoception, where people have shown that if you have better interoception, you tend to have better physical and mental health outcomes. You have better emotional regulation, better decision making, and things like that. And how do you know whether somebody has better interoception, that they are aware of these signals coming from their body? That's a tricky part. But one sort of experiment people do is they ask people, like if all of you are sitting here, they would ask them, what is your resting heart rate? And people, what they've shown is the cohort of people who are good at guessing what their heart rate is, the resting heart rate, they tend to have better health outcomes. And so they have better interoception because they're more aware of their signals. But that's how they measure interoception. But then they find that this cohort tends to have better health outcomes for all sorts of things. So in this work, what we wanted to look was, because we are working in language and computation, can we use language to shed light on this connection of the body with the mind, emotions, health, and behavior? And so here, for example, are some random examples of people talking about their body parts. Here are some examples where they are referring to their body part in a more abstract way. Here are examples of active metaphor. So they're not referring to a particular person's body, but the body is playing a role in metaphor. Here are some examples where these are fossilized, weak metaphorical connections that we don't even see those metaphorical connections anymore, but they were originally there, right? So every use of BPMs, what you wanted to say was this relation between body and mind, but also how natural language is connected to the physical world from which it originates. And we explored a bunch of questions. First set of questions is simply on the body parts, and the second question is on body and emotions. And to start with was a simple question: to what extent do we use body parts mentions in our language? You know, how often do we talk about that? But we have a series of questions. I don't have all the time, but I'll go through some of these questions. Turns out we tend to use it fairly well, 5 to 10%, depending on how you count it, how many terms you have for body part mentions and so on. But this is fairly large. When I first thought about it, I thought, you know, maybe it's 0.001% or something. But essentially, we have no idea. So it was good to actually do the experiment and see where that falls. Turns out it's fairly consistent across different platforms, and we use it fairly well. And one of the other questions was, do we talk about our body parts more in certain months of the year than in other parts? And I wouldn't have guessed this. I would have got this wrong. But turns out we talk more in early spring and summer and less in November, and so to speak, right? Do we talk about body parts more or less as the day goes on? And again, we see that in the weekends, there is less body parts, and on the middle of the week, more body parts. This is actually fascinating because it also ties with other work on anxiety where I did, where you have a very similar graph of anxiety being higher in the midweek and lower in the rest of the week and things like that. Do individuals in different regions refer to their bodies at different frequencies? Canada versus US? Turns out, yeah, Canadians is on the left for different years, Americans on the right for different years. Canadians use fewer body part mentions. Consistent. What about US cities from different regions? Turns out the coastal cities use body parts fewer. Central cities tend to use it much more. Another question, set of questions was on is body part mention related to emotions, right? If we look at sentences that refer to body parts, are those sentences more emotional than other sentences? Are they less emotional, or are they the same? It turns out they are more emotional. They're markedly more emotional than non-body part mention sentences. And another question, it's hard to read this graph, but another question was, what is the emotion associations with different body parts? Are all the body parts associated with the same emotion a whole lot, or different emotions go to different body parts? I mean, our initial hypothesis was different things go to different body parts. You know, that we have some, just by using language, we have some basis for that, and that's what we found. So things like, and we especially looked for things like my body part mention, because we wanted to look at mentions where people are talking about their own body part. And we found like my stomach is associated a whole lot more with sadness, my chest with anger, and so on. There are some variations on this as well on different platforms and domains. So I think that's always a good thing when you find these variations. So stops you from making too strong claims. But it also goes to show that our behavior in different platforms can be a little different. But overall, we do see a lot of negative emotions dominating the high frequency body part mentions. And then we have this final question in this work on, are BPMs correlated with health outcomes? And turns out that the line at the bottom, the last two show that if you just look at various cities from the US and calculate the proportion of body part mentions from these tweets, those scores are highly correlated, or moderate to highly correlated with data on physical health, mental health, and so on, that these various cities have released. And this was pretty interesting because if you just take the number of tweets, that's not very correlated at all. If you just take emotion words, it's correlated a little bit. Fear was the one that gave us the best correlations, but it's not that much more than random. But looking at body parts played a big role there. All right, so just to summarize that work, we use body part mentions a whole lot, and that's correlated with health. There are all kinds of interesting things you can do with this. We only are scratching the surface on this. And we've only done this for English. We really should be doing this more for various other languages as well, to again then see how much consistency we find across these different languages and cultures. And also to look at what are the cultural norms around body part mentions and what are the differences, right? So, all right, last topic, ethical considerations. Any questions?
There's one here.
Yeah.
Just a small one.
Yeah.
Since you're based in Canada, I wonder, like, you were talking about language differences. Do you also work with like French corpus or?
Well, there are people in our group that work a whole lot with French corpora as well. I haven't. I do not speak French. I speak a few languages, but not French. If I ever have an opportunity, a collaborator who speaks that language, that would be a good thing to work. One issue, though, just with that is that sometimes, because I work for NRC, the government organization, they get worried about social media data too much when it connects to politics and things like that, because they have to stand out as more neutral. So within Canada things. So comparing Canada and French thing might ruffle some feathers in that sort of sense. The people who work with French in NRC do that for machine translation purposes. And
Just like roughly 10 minutes.
yeah, good point. Yeah, I'll wrap this up now. We have, let's talk about ethical considerations in this work. When people talk about ethical considerations, often they talk about the data set or evaluation, but I like to point out that this applies to the whole life cycle of any research work that you're doing, right? And one very important phase in that, right at the beginning, is the task that you're working on. Emotion recognition as a task, many people will say it's about inferring emotions felt by the speaker. But really, there are many different ways in which you can design or think about what this task is. Maybe another sort of formulation is inferring emotions of the speaker as perceived by the reader. Okay, that's different. It's not the same as number one. Another task might be inferring emotions that the speaker is attempting to convey. Or maybe you're interested in emotions evoked in the reader. Or maybe you're interested in emotions of people mentioned in the text. Or maybe you care about, this person said something here. Is that good or bad for my product or for my government policy? Things like that. That's very different from this thing. But if you look at real world sentiment analysis work, they care about that, right? They don't care if you're angry or sad. They care about what do you think about their product, and they call that sentiment analysis. So there are all kinds of formulations of what emotion recognition is, and it's important to be aware about that. All of these come with benefits, potential harms, and ethical considerations, right? So if you go back to the Lisa Barrett thing, this idea of universality of emotions became very dangerous, because you had all these companies saying, yeah, I can just take a video and then I can figure out, based on your facial expressions, what emotions you're feeling. And then, yeah, you can use this for judging refugee claims and do things like that. But Lisa Barrett's work was very important in sort of discrediting some of these tenets, and also showing the importance of person-to-person variation, and that you can get a sense of a valence from facial expressions, but you can't reliably distinguish anger, sadness, fear, whatever, optimism, things like that. So while emotion recognition is a very powerful tool to unlock all sorts of benefits for people like those listed on the top, they've also been used to do mass surveillance of vulnerable populations, their privacy concerns, their unreliable approaches. Not all companies, but there are companies that will sell anything. It does not matter whether the science works or not. If they can sell the product to somebody, they will sell it, right? So it's important for us as NLP researchers to send the right signals to whoever is using them in research, so that and various other stakeholders about where emotion recognition works, doesn't work, and how to use that best. To me, in 2021 or so, I decided I will write a document just for myself to list out these various ethical considerations with emotion recognition, just because if somebody asks me, hey, Seth, what are the ethical considerations for this task you're working on? I'll not give them an ad hoc answer. I will be able to tell them, yes, I thought about this thing, I wrote these things, and here it is. Right? Turns out CL Journal accepted it as a paper result, so that's a nice bonus. And I also created this ACL paper, which talks about the various steps or the various things that you can think about for ethical considerations for your task. It doesn't have to be emotion recognition. If you're working on any task, I think it's important to think about the ethical considerations for that and document. I'll quickly end by saying that in the last 2 years, we also did work with various emotion recognition tasks where we're working on not just on English, but on, in this task, we have 14 languages from mostly all from Africa. And we have another shared task this year at ACL where we have data sets from 35 languages and predominantly from Africa and Asia. And so this is another issue that we have to think about to not leave a whole bunch of languages behind. All right, with that, I will end this talk. You've been great, asked wonderful questions. I appreciate that very much, and I'm happy to take more questions.
You get 1 to 2 questions max.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry about the whole bit.
But then there is lunch, and
Okay.
I would say if you find people should come to
Absolutely.
you.
I would even say, please reach out to me, email me. If you ever want to discuss things, I'm happy to do it.
And at 1, just for everyone, because the lunch is done there, and then there will be a sponsored talk to Amazon again in the inside. So just that you're aware. Go for the questions.
Any questions? Yeah.
I have a question. If you are aware of any NLP work related to polyvagal theory?
Okay. I don't know the polyvagal theory. I'm sorry.
It's a very interesting theory of Stephen Porges about 3 different types of states of neural system.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'm not aware.
Okay.
Okay. I'll look it up.
Just perhaps a question about how this or any of the findings of yours could be extended to, for example, LLMs or chatbots, those things that are really relevant.
It's interesting how you phrased that question. I get what you're asking, but I want to say something about how what this tries to is in research. It's good to think about what are we centering. Are we centering a research question about let's say language, emotions, health, behavior, or whatever, or are we centering a machine learning algorithm and saying that we are creating this new machine learning algorithm, or this variant to this, or doing something new in terms of machine learning over here? These are 2 different sort of goals in some way, right? And when you're reviewing papers, it makes sense to think about those things. What is this paper trying to do? Are they trying to propose a new machine learning thing, or are they centering a research question about how emotions work or whatever, right? And if you have a question, if your research question is on something like how emotions work or whatever, you will use the tools that make the most sense for that. And perhaps LLMs make sense for many things, perhaps they don't. But just using LLMs for the sake of using LLMs because reviewers might want it seems.
Perhaps I misphrased it. I meant how, for example, in the way that the user interactions work, how the choice of language, so the syntax by the LM would evoke essentially or affect the emotion felt, or how by the responses. Sorry.
Can I throw in something? Because I had a similar thought, not with LLMs. Like, have you looked at how the situation basically changes the language used? Like, I was thinking about that when we have this mistrust word.
Right.
Maybe in the family you get more trust, and then when you get outside, you learn more mistrust.
Right.
And in a professional context, you use different language.
Absolutely. And actually, to speak more to what you were saying, some things that we are interested in, and feel free to scoop us, is to look at LLM language to see. I talk about emotion dynamics, emotion granularity, and things like that. Do LLMs have emotion dynamics characteristics that are similar to humans, or is it very different? And if it's different, in what way? And if it's different, what are the implications of that? Similarly for emotion granularity and things like that, right? So I think there are, even if we are working with LLMs or whatever, artificial agents of any sort, and if you're looking at generation, language, and things like that, these theories from psychology can be very helpful in grounding that research and asking the right questions and looking at interesting ways. Like even that warmth and competence, for example, I think that's very interesting to look at. I mean, that's some work that we are trying to do right now as well, is that it brings another framework of how to look at stereotypes and things like that, and apply that to not just to human language, but also to LLM language.
I was involved briefly in robopsychology, and we kind of looked at the phenomenon of anthropomorphism.
Yeah, yeah.
And especially with regards to LLMs, so how certain words and the ways that people interact with them, how they evoke, I mean, certain emotions and trust and competence and how they perceive that, and what outcomes this may have, which are negative.
Yeah.
So trusting or thinking or really anthropomorphic, so thinking of it as a human being. And
Send me a link to your work.
sure.
Any other questions?
I think we should.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate your attention.